In early 1939, the United States Army Air Corps, the USAAC, issued a request calling for proposals for a new twin-engined high-altitude fighter. This all might seem a bit abrupt, as the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, which had just been selected to fulfill that very role, hadn't even been ordered into production yet. However, the USAAC recognised the pace that military aviation technology was ripping along at, and, with war clouds in Europe definitely on the horizon, evidently wanted to stay ahead of the game. The favoured offering for the new proposal was, probably understandably, the Lockheed XP-49. This was essentially a souped-up version of the P-38, with more powerful engines and a pressurised cockpit. But that isn't the aircraft we are going to look at today. Instead, let's examine its primary competitor. An unusual option, as the manufacturer, Grumman, was, and indeed still is, very much known for their specialisation in naval aircraft. The aircraft in question is the Grumman XP-50, and had things worked out differently, it may have been a mainstream aircraft that was well known today, rather than a largely forgotten one. The origins of the XP-50 go back to an earlier and related design, the Grumman XF-5F Skyrocket. This was originally built to a US Navy requirement for a lightweight, fast, hard-hitting carrier-based interceptor. And if you want to know more about that aircraft, I have a video on it that I will link to at the end. The promise that the XF-5F showed caught the interest of the USAAC, and when Grumman entered a proposal for a version of that aircraft for their use, the Army Air Corps ordered a version modified for their specific requirements. The intention was for this to serve as a backup in the event of the failure of the XP-49. The new aircraft was company designated by Grumman as the G-45 and by the Air Corps as the XP-50. Compared to the original XF-5F, the new aircraft had several major changes and improvements. Most notable was the new nose, in that it actually had one, in contrast to the original XF-5F. This allowed the XP-50 to house a nose wheel, which gave the aircraft a tricycle undercarriage, in contrast to its predecessor's tail dragger configuration. The nose was also intended to house the armament, which, should the aircraft have got into service, was to be two 20mm cannon and two 50 caliber Browning heavy machine guns. Additionally, wing racks were fitted for the carriage of two small bombs. The two engines were also comparatively small for a combat aircraft of the time, being Wright R1820 radials. These were 9-cylinder single-row engines, at a time when twin-row radials, or water-cooled inline engines, were largely becoming the standard fit for fighters, as well as pointing the way forward for more powerful engine development. 9-cylinder engines were getting somewhat old hat by this point, but to compensate for this, the XP-50's engines were fitted with turbo superchargers to maximise their effectiveness at altitude. As a result, the engines produced 1,200 horsepower each, and, more importantly, delivered high power rates as the aircraft climbed. In addition, the XP-50 was built with provision for the fitting of self-sealing fuel tanks and armour for the pilot, which was forward-thinking, as when the prototype was ordered in November 1939, the war in Europe was only a few months old, and the proper lessons of modern air combat had still to be learnt. In fact, the order for the XP-50 was also only a few months after the actual production purchase of the P-38 was made, and a month after the XP-49's authorisation. Although the XP-50 was not a priority, and Grumman had more than enough work on already, meeting orders for existing aircraft from both the United States and export customers, the prototype was pretty quick in development, and first flight was made in February 1941. And the XP-50 appears to have been very good. If the test pilots had liked the previous XF-5F, then apparently the XP-50 was even better, with excellent handling and performance. The aircraft proved extremely capable at altitude, as well as a nimble performer. Estimated top speed was 424 miles per hour, and the rate of climb was also exceptional at an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 feet per minute. You've probably noticed my saying estimated, because unfortunately the XP-50 was to suffer an early mishap. On the 14th of May 1941, on its 15th test flight, one of the turbochargers exploded. The aircraft was severely damaged, and the test pilot, Robert Hall, had to bail out. The XP-50 subsequently crashed into Long Island Sound and was lost. Hall was unhurt, probably fortunately, as he was instrumental in helping to design some follow-on aircraft, like the Hellcat, the Bearcat, the Panther, the Cougar, the Jaguar, and the Tiger. You may have heard of some of them. But for the XP-50 program, the loss of the aircraft finished any hope for its seeing production, despite its promise. As said, it was always intended as a backup for the XP-49, which incidentally wouldn't fly until November 1942 and would prove a failure. But at the time of the XP-50's loss, the XP-49 was of greater priority to the USAAC, with the XP-50 essentially being largely irrelevant. They instead took the funding allocated for the XP-50 and invested it in a joint project with the US Navy for a new Grumman aircraft, the G-65. Though that project too would ultimately fall by the wayside, it laid the basis for a new aircraft, the F-7F Tiger Cat, which was used by the US Navy and the Marines. It's easy to use hindsight when it comes to military procurement decisions, but one must wonder what would have happened had the Army placed proper focus on the possibilities offered by the XP-50. It may well have turned into a truly formidable fighter and interceptor. With the failure of the XP-49, that is also entirely possible. But in reality, it probably wouldn't have got a chance to show what it could do in service for two main reasons. Firstly, the USAAC was, as already said, already using the P-38, and that proved a very good aircraft all round and displayed plenty of scope for improvement throughout the war by adapting to new weapons and, perhaps more importantly, new engines. Upgrading engines on an aircraft design is a complex process which doesn't guarantee success. The XP-50's use of the R1820 would likely have meant that trying to use bigger, heavier and more powerful engines may have proven tricky, perhaps impossible, and that would have seen the aircraft gradually fall behind in potential performance against rival aircraft. The other factor that must be remembered is that Grumman was, as said, the US Navy's primary aircraft builder. Grumman's construction capacity was a distinct concern, and consuming that to build aircraft for the Army may not have proven popular, politic, or necessarily the best choice in strategic terms. So the XP-50 probably only had the slightest chance of getting into service anyway, even if it hadn't experienced the misfortune it did. But, having said all this, it must be admitted that the XP-50 is one heck of a what-if aircraft.